Thank you so much for being here today, everyone, and for taking the time to listen in and get some more information about survivor-centered legal advocacy. I am Heather. I'll be talking a little bit more about myself, but I am new in this role as the Legal Advocacy Program Coordinator here at WSCADV, and I'm very excited to get to know everyone and what folks are needing out in your various programs in different settings, and really excited about being able to support you in all things legal advocacy and survivor-centered advocacy in general. I just wanted to take a moment. I'm saying this just as much for myself as you all, and not just for this webinar today, but for everything we do legal advocacy. Every time I've seen this shared before, it has a huge impact on me. So I just wanted to say, take this moment. You're getting to sit down and listen to a webinar. Maybe you're having to do other things at the same time too, but to the extent possible, to be present and really think about the work that we're doing and be able to relax. This is something I like to come back to in the middle of busy work times. So like I said, wanted to share that with you all because even just taking a moment to relax your shoulders and jaw can really change how you feel in your whole body, and that can really impact your advocacy. So for today's agenda, I'm going to do some brief introductions of myself and talk a little bit more with you all. I'm going to be sharing out some of those legal advocacy survey results. Some of you may have participated in that over the summer, and that had some really great information for me. Then we're going to be discussing a really great article, Remembering Who We Work For, that I came across as I was getting into my position here at WSCADV. And then we'll go into some of the challenges and difficulties of legal advocacy and how survivor-centered advocacy can be an antidote to that. And then I'll also be sharing out some specific tools to help undocumented survivors, and also some transformative justice resources that I've really been jazzed about and want to make sure that you all can check out as well. All right, so going into the main content here. Hello everyone, I'm Heather. So you can't see me right now because I want to share my screen, but that's me. I am super excited to introduce myself to everyone as the new Legal Advocacy Program Coordinator. I am from rural Pennsylvania. I've lived in Washington for almost 4 years now. So I have that rural experience growing up. I started doing gender-based violence work as a researcher. I researched some different community-based interventions in indigenous communities in Guatemala, actually. And through doing that work, I realized that I really love advocacy and connecting with people. And so I decided to transition out of doing the research and transition into doing direct service. And that was when I really found my stride, I would say, and my passion as an advocate. I really love advocacy. I love how flexible it is because we're not, case managers tied to a very specific program. We're often able to move and do more of what survivors need than a lot of other social service providers. So I think that's something that's really cool about being an advocate. I started doing that work at a rape crisis center in Jacksonville, Florida, and we covered 3 counties in that area. So we had, 1 predominantly urban county and 2 very rural counties. I was doing accompaniment for forensic exams, a lot of criminal legal advocacy accompaniment for reporting, detective interviews, all that kind of stuff. So that's where I would say I did the most criminal legal advocacy. Also civil, of course, with going for protection orders more than anything, and some other civil legal navigation. Then when I moved out here to Washington, I have worked at LifeWire on their housing stability team, and doing a lot of housing and homelessness advocacy there. And then ultimately was at the Northwest Network of Bisexual, Trans, Lesbian, and Gay Survivors of Abuse, working at a by and for organization, which was really a huge goal of mine, and that was a really great perspective to get there as well, to be able to work within my own community. So if anyone has any questions at any point, I just wanted you to get kind of the lowdown on who I am, where I'm from, how I got to be here. I pursued this position because, like I said before, I'm really excited about supporting advocates, and a colleague here at WSCADV, often describes herself as an advocate for advocates, and that just seems like the perfect description of what I think of when I think about what I'm doing here in this job. So really quick, I wanted to know from you all, how long have you been at your job? If you can go ahead and put that in the chat. Very cool. So we've got 6 months and 4 months. We've got 10 years, 13 years, 7.5 years. Just started in September. That's when I started this position. Very cool. So I'm going to go into this a little bit more, but I've noticed that legal advocates are often some of the advocates that stick around the longest, which I find really interesting, and I definitely want to learn more about what that's about, and support you all to stay in the work if that's what you want to do, and continue to find it lively. Very cool. 14 years, 2 years at different locations. Great. Okay, so can folks raise their hand if they think that they participated in the legal advocacy survey that we put out this summer? Okay, so got at least 7 or so people that think that they participated. Very cool. So we got this information. I just wanted to share it back briefly with you all before we get into some of the other content that I have today. So this survey was conducted this past summer, and we got responses from 97 advocates, which we're very happy about. We got some different information about who those advocates were and the programs that they worked at. So, about 68%, their primary role was legal advocacy. And, if that's not the case, I know there are lots of folks that do community advocacy, let's say, or they do everything, and so they might not have put legal advocacy as their primary goal, but they're still doing it. So that was really helpful just to get an idea of how many people are able to specialize, and how many are doing that on top of everything else, even though to some extent I'm very aware that everyone's doing a little bit of everything. Geographic area wise, we were also very pleased because we got really great rural representation there, about 1/3 of people working at rural programs, and then suburban and urban programs as well, which lined out about exact, or actually a little bit overrepresentative of rural programs, which I think is really great, just to make sure that we're grounding ourselves in those needs as well. And then time and role, this is what I was mentioning earlier, just that a whole 1/3 of people being in their roles for over 5 years, which woohoo, like, thanks for staying in it. And I know that can be really hard, not just how hard the work is, but, a whole slew of reasons. Um, and I think that just is real testament to, someone in the chat mentioned the passion is what people keeps people in it. And I think there is something really special about legal advocacy, even though it's super difficult, which we are going to talk about more. So some of the takeaways from this survey that I wanted to highlight, um, I went through all the data. We asked a lot of questions about survivors' experiences, and advocates were answering um, as per what they see in their work. And so something that came across really loud and clear was survivors' distrust and fear of law enforcement and the legal system, both civil and legal, civil and criminal. And so 76% of survivors were concerned that police would only make the situation worse, which I think is very interesting, and very clear. And that also lines up pretty closely with the national hotline survey data. If anyone's familiar with that, or if you're not, I'm more than happy to share that. But in 2015, the national hotline did a survey of their callers, and they break it down between people who have access to the police already, people who haven't, and their feelings about that. And, really just looking at how survivors are feeling and what options they feel safe accessing. It's not, necessarily about the police or the jobs that they're doing, but just like how survivors are thinking about their options. And then 61% of survivors, when we asked why they wouldn't call the police, or maybe not access a legal remedy, the answer was that, they doubted that any of the options would reduce the abuse. And so, we have to think about not just, if people are worried that these options would make the situation worse, but if they don't think that it would reduce the abuse and that's what people are really wanting, then we need to think about, well, what can we be doing that might reduce the abuse, or even if it's not a legal or systems response. Another statistic that we had from the survey was that 97% of immigrant survivors fear contacting law enforcement, which is, that's very stark and also very understandable, just given the general political climate around immigration, and what people know to be true about deportation, etc. So just keeping in mind, even if you have been doing great work with law enforcement in your area or with your legal systems, just like remembering that climate of fear that is really present for a lot of survivors, and how much that impacts our work. Another takeaway from that, we got a lot of information about experiences of discrimination. And so here I'm highlighting how, we specifically asked about people of color, immigrants, Native American survivors, and LGBTQ survivors, and some of their different experiences. 87% of advocates having worked with survivors of color who face discrimination. That question to me was one of the most rich, because people wrote in over 50 of you all wrote in specific experiences of discrimination that survivors you had worked with had gone through. And that is just so rich, because we all know that's happening and that has been happening, but just the more documentation that we have of that at this point, it's not a controversial statement to make. It's just a fact that these systems aren't working how anyone would have hoped that they could. And so, we had a quote here that I think just really distilled everything. Immigrant clients, especially Spanish speakers, already know they will be treated differently before they go to court, because they've encountered this in almost every system they participate in. So I just felt like that was a really great way of putting it, the legal system isn't necessarily exceptional if you're, navigating a society that doesn't treat immigrants with respect, right? So it's just part of um, all of the oppression that those folks are experiencing. All right. And the other thing that I did want to say about that the last point, and really just continuing to build with um, this slide's takeaways here, is just that given this reality that we know that survivors, are fearful of systems, and that survivors are experiencing discrimination and bias from these systems, given that reality, we really have to focus on survivors' well-being, even as legal advocates, as they're navigating these systems. What space can we create to talk about what will feel better? How can we make time for pauses and a lot of that good bread and butter emotional support that we know advocacy can offer, given how difficult and damaging a lot of these systems can be. Advocates also asked for strategies to combat discrimination, which is something I am very interested in working on further, and sharing learnings from each other about how we can address discrimination and bias, because there's the way that you can address it for an individual survivor, and then there's taking it to that higher level where addressing systems, whether that be from a state level or within your county, and bringing all that data so that we can make some real bigger change. So some of these other takeaways here: survivors really fear CPS and losing their children. So that came across the board, not necessarily only people involved with CPS. That was just a fear that came across for people getting involved in any system, which I'm sure many of you are used to hearing. And so, for instance, immigrant survivors fearing police, when we asked what the fear was, about 83% answered that the fear was of losing their children. And so we need to remember that might be survivors' number one goal, might be to have a parenting plan for if and when they face deportation, and knowing that their children are going to be okay. That might supersede all of the violence that they're experiencing in their life. And so just remembering that, as doing survivor-centered advocacy, it does mean listening to survivors and following what they need first. Something else that was really clear from the survey is that we need more family law support and lawyers and attorneys to represent folks. A lot of times an abusive partner has representation and survivor doesn't, or just these cases can be really complex, and what survivors really need is family law support, and it's just so limited. So if you're out there feeling like maybe things were better somewhere else, like, I just want you to know that you're not alone, and that is a huge statewide problem, and something that I'd love to put our heads together about building more relationships with attorneys and getting some more options for folks. And then last but not least, economic instability and housing instability greatly impact legal options when people know that maybe they would lose their housing from a protection order, even if they're wanting to get away from, an abusive partner, or, if their abusive partner gets arrested and then they lose their job, then they lose their housing, the economic precarity of the situation really takes away a lot of choice as well. And so these are the main takeaways from the survey. And so I want to thank you all for participating so much. I also did want to highlight, in addition to immigrant survivors' fear of losing their children, we did hear from a lot of Native communities that fear of losing children was a huge factor in accessing legal options or law enforcement. And so I just want to highlight that as well, and just sit with the, the history in our country that would lead to having that sort of fear, and how valid that is. All right. So now I wanted to share with you all, I started my position and I was looking through some old WSCADV writings, and I came across this article called Remembering Who We Work For by Stephanie Avalon. That picture is not Stephanie Avalon. If you happen to have liked the X-Files, we have Dana Scully there, and this newsletter was called the A-Files. I don't know if anyone remembers it from back in the day, but A stood for Advocacy, and I found this article and I was just so fired up and blown away because I couldn't believe that it was written in 1999. I will have this linked and shared as a PDF with this webinar so that you can take a look at it. But I got so fired up about it because so much of what Stephanie is writing about in this article is still going on today, and just felt like such a grounding force to read that. And so I'm going to share a little bit with you all from this article. So these are some quotes that Stephanie shared, which I believe she was working for the Battered Women's Justice Project, which is a great resource if you haven't checked it out. They just have a ton of information to share with you all. But these are some of the quotes that really struck me. And part of this could be my advocacy nerd coming out, but I love thinking about like where we fit into the puzzle and how nimble we can be as advocates, really. So she said this thing, when we first entered the court to support battered women's use of legal system, our role as advocates was essentially to challenge the legal system. And so I thought about that, and I was like, I can completely see how that was the case when there weren't legal options for survivors. There weren't necessarily advocates stationed at the courthouse to help people fill out protection order paperwork, which I know is not the case in all parts of the state. But just even the fact that exists anywhere, shows that things are different than they were before. But there was also like that spirit of that challenge, I think, is something that we can get back in touch with because of how much we know that these systems just aren't functioning in favor of survivors. And if our role as the advocates is to stand with survivors and center their needs, then we really do need to maintain some of that separateness. And so she also said, when we operate within a system, we lose perspective we gain if we could stand outside. And so that really struck me and made me think of my time as an advocate in Florida. And so, as I mentioned, I was on the rape response team, and we supported law enforcement so much in our role. We, in that state, advocates from a nonprofit accompany survivors to forensic exams, accompany them to report to the police. And I got so used to telling people what this process was for reporting and how much time they had and what their options were. I just got so used to saying that to people over and over that I forgot to slow down and give very much space to talk about how that person was feeling and how that option sounded to them. And I think I also slowly started to see it as a very clear option that wasn't a big deal. And now sitting where I am and reading this article, I'm just thinking like, wow, like I can see how some of my perspective was lost. Not completely, because a lot of the advocacy I did with folks was to push back on law enforcement or get the survivor what they needed, or say this didn't feel good, can we get another detective? So I was definitely still doing that, but I can just remember how much closer I was aligned to that system than I am now. And so knowing that that system is so limited, I think that part of our job can be sitting in that discomfort and that necessary tension, and checking ourselves on it, just as an ongoing practice, and how important that can be, because we need to maintain our agenda, which our agenda really is the survivor's agenda, or whatever survivor we're working with. And so, I know that in a lot of ways that's a basic tenet of the work that we do, but no one is immune to the inertia of like these huge systems that have their own goals. And so what Stephanie said really resonated with me in that moment as I was reflecting on all the legal advocacy I've done. And then she raised these two questions that I really loved, and I would like to invite everyone to hold these questions near and dear to our hearts and minds as we do legal advocacy. So she asked, how do we maintain survivor-centered advocacy strategies in the face of legal systems that have their own priorities? And it could be just neutral that these legal systems have their own priorities, and that's fine. It's just that we are here for the survivors' priorities, and that's often not what a legal response is looking at. It's looking at, going through the motions for what it's set up to do, whether that's a criminal system or a civil system. And so the other question she raised was, how can we work in and with civil and criminal justice systems and remain distinct and separate from them? And again, maybe this was just me nerding out, but like the fact that we get to be distinct and separate from them, unless you are a systems advocate, of course, which if you're on here and you're a systems advocate, I think my guess is you're most likely trying to figure out how to be that voice for survivors in a distinct way while also being in that system. So I know there's a lot of great work happening in those systems as well. But for community-based advocates, it's like, how can I be this completely survivor-centered force in the mix of this survivor's life as they're, going to this system, maybe they're having to go through a divorce proceeding, maybe there was a criminal case, maybe they didn't decide to do any of that, but they were brought into it through CPS, or maybe they just wanted to pursue breaking a lease, and that led to something. So there's so many ways that people get brought into the legal system, and I think it's just really important that we ground ourselves and think of this distinction as almost like our superpower, the fact that we are focused on survivors and we don't have to follow what any one system says. We can focus on survivors, and that's who we're beholden to. Okay, so I just wanted to, before I went into where I'm going with this, I wanted to hear from you all of what you think is so difficult about legal advocacy. You don't necessarily, if you don't think it's difficult, that's okay too, but just what the challenges that comes up most often for you. If you could go ahead and put that in the chat, I would love to hear what some of that is, whether that's directly related to what I've been talking about or not. Networking. So is that maybe connecting with the different players in your community? When do you think of networking? Time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Addressing trauma in that setting. Yeah, there's definitely not, the legal system is not a trauma-informed space. That's for sure. But we carve a little bit of that out um, as advocates in our role, right? Um, being in a remote community, and it's hard because we all know one another. That is a good one, and that is very difficult. Yeah, helping survivors navigate the court system or procedures while they're struggling with their mental health. Yes, because we all know how, it's hard for the survivor and their mental health, but we also know how the legal system wants survivors to present in a certain way, right? And so when people are dealing with mental health issues, that's really difficult. Um, yep. And lack of legal resources, and so many of the survivors we work for are, going through this all pro se, and that can be really difficult to see and just know that this person really needs legal representation, right? Um, yeah, and walking that fine line of not wanting to step on other people's toes and wanting to be effective. Um, but, I have no doubt that if, you know, being a legal advocate is so hard because we're trying to navigate all these different spaces, right? And have the survivor be heard. And so sometimes that, we don't get to just run up to the judge and really advocate for the survivor how we want to, because there's so many rules that we need to play by their game, right? Yeah, a lot to know and takes time to learn how to navigate. Yeah, yeah. So great. Those are all really helpful things to hear. Some of the inherent challenges that I was thinking of are just that the legal system adds uncertainty. So, they can, after a survivor chooses to do something, they don't have control over what the judge or the commissioner, the decision that they're going to make. Obviously, we can prepare as much as possible. We can prepare for the hearing. We can prepare what they're going to say. They can prepare with their lawyer if they have one. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of um, there's a lot of uncertainty in that, and so they tend to be, survivors end up being at the mercy of the legal system and their players, which can just be a really hard mental and emotional experience. um, I think the other reason it's hard, which some people brought up, is like for some folks there's limited or no legal options, or there are some legal options but they don't have an attorney or representation, and so that can make it really really difficult to know that this person's not getting what they need. And so when I was thinking through this about, what is that like inherent difficulty of the legal system, it just felt like, a lot of it is at odds with self-determination, because the legal system isn't like, survivor, what do you want? Let's make that happen, right? And that can be really hard for people. I've seen it be really empowering for folks to decide to, like say, go apply for a protection order, or, go make a report with law enforcement. But then kind of, after that point, they lose a lot of that self-determination, because it's handed over to that system, right? So, an antidote to that, and really trying to focus on what is within our purview, what's within our control, is focusing on providing survivor-centered advocacy. And so, I actually think of that as clarifying our role a lot. If we're focusing on the survivor, we can't um, fix or change the family law system, or we can't fix or change what the prosecutor's going to do, but we can really focus on the survivor and carving out small moments for healing or self-determination within this larger system that is doing what it needs to do. So I definitely want this to be the beginning of our conversation, and also, think of a survivor that doesn't have legal options. don't think of that as the, end of the conversation, which I'm sure many of you are not, but just encouraging us to like breathe into some spaciousness and think of that as the beginning of the conversation. And okay, then what? And I know a lot of folks working in marginalized communities who can't access legal options are probably really aware of this. So for example, if there weren't any legal options or a survivor didn't feel comfortable pursuing any legal options, and that might, mean going more towards asking them what they need and exploring healing and validation, or maybe it means joining a support group or asking coworkers for support if someone doesn't want to file for a protection order. So just getting creative and going back to a lot of that basic advocacy that I know we all are grounded in as a place to move forward. So what can that look like? A lot of what's listed here I think of as the bread and butter of advocacy. And, I'm saying this just to remind us that even though there's so much legal information that we can know, um, really being able to slow down and ground into these types of approaches that are very survivor-centered is what is going to make a huge difference for survivors. So, I think of this as you're getting, you've been doing legal advocacy for a while, you've been hearing a lot of different situations. So someone starts to talk to you, and in your head, you start to think through like what all that person's legal options are, or you start to think like, okay, they're telling you a story about, some assault that happened, and you're like, when did that happen? Because you're thinking through your head, you know, is that within the time frame for a protection order, or does that meet this threshold or that threshold? Um, and so that's all like very helpful planning, and like, that is so understandable that that's where our brains are going. But, wanting to be able to slow down and make sure that um, the first things that we're doing for survivors are, um, reflecting back to them how difficult that sounds like it is, and like checking in if they're okay and what they need. Um, Strengths that you see in them and the choices that they've been making, and identifying what they've done in the past. These are all things that we do in advocacy all the time. I'm just, I'm speaking from personal experience and just what I've seen, that in the high volume and high stress of legal advocacy, sometimes the moments for this stuff can get lost because we don't have time, and because options are limited, or because the prosecutor is calling you, or they're pressuring you why this person doesn't want to cooperate anymore. Whatever it is, right? There's not as much time naturally for these things. I have gotten into Chanel Miller lately. If you don't know, she's an amazing young woman and survivor of the what was in the news as the Stanford sexual assault case with Brock Turner. And I just wanted to share this quote from her book that I read because I thought it was so great in terms of looking at what legal advocacy can be. And so I'll just go ahead and read this here. As we waited, my advocate Bree arrived. I noticed she'd gotten a haircut. It was nice to talk about her hairstyle like we were friends in a normal context, and she had not been assigned to me from the YWCA, so I wouldn't be alone. When she saw me fidgeting, she told me to press the soles of my feet to the ground, a grounding technique. She reached into her purse and pulled out a toy, a long bright blue wiener dog that had fur like rubbery spaghetti. It may be helpful to have something to squeeze while you're up there, she said. I stretched it out, shook it around. My sister got a squishy skull. And if you get a chance to read this book, it's definitely not a light read. It's very heavy on legal process and system. and what she went through with her court case. But I loved this so much. I was wondering if folks could point out like what survivor-centered strategies you see in this excerpt from the reading about her advocate. Just if you could just type it in the chat, any of the strategies, because I think there's actually a couple. Yeah, grounding techniques. So I'm sure that's something a lot of folks are doing, is offering those up in the moment, which can be really great. Offering some coping tools. I even just love, the thing is, when you read the memoir and you read what she shares out about her advocate, as someone who really loves advocacy, it's really interesting to see what are the things that stick with people, right? Because it might not be the thing that you thought was the most impactful in the moment, right? But the things that people remember, she remembers chatting with her advocate about her hairstyle. Being able to like mix in heavy, like roll with the heavy content, but then also, yes, exactly. She felt like she was with a friend, which could be comforting. I mean, being able to have those, like, mix in those light conversations if and when appropriate, and just be a person, how that can be what really sticks with people. And she does this throughout the book. She mentions different things about her advocates and how they looked at her, or how they were her bathroom buddy, and things that in the context of everything else that's going on, that are just very, very sweet, and reminded me a lot of why advocacy is so important. Or sometimes as advocates, we might not feel like we're doing a whole lot, and that this whole process is going on, and there's not much we were able to do. We weren't able to like come in and save the day. But remembering that this day-to-day coping and support and showing up and being there for people is really what's going to stick with folks. Also, if you don't know, Chanel Miller is also a visual artist. She does illustrations. They're super cool. Highly recommend following her on Instagram. I'm her new biggest fan, so definitely check that out if you're interested in. Okay, so that was a very small example, but I would love to hear from you all what you think of as some survivor-centered strategies that you're already using. So it doesn't have to be this coping stuff that was from the quote, but it could be anything that you're thinking about now that we've started this discussion. If you could just go ahead and put it in the chat, that would be great. Maybe it's something that you hadn't really thought of as something you were doing before. I know if I was able to, meeting with people beforehand or near the courthouse or something, and getting some tea to like, breathe beforehand, risk assessment for safety planning. Yeah, emotional regulation. Yep. Those are all real legal advocacy strategies as well. I don't want us to stay limited to like thinking that talking someone through what a protection order process is going to look like. or something like that is the only legal advocacy strategy that's valid, that can be really helpful because you give people an overview of the process, but there's a lot of feelings that come up in the process. So that's a huge part of what we're doing too. All right. Supporting with finding childcare. Yeah. Okay. So the next thing that I wanted to go into is more, more of what are some ways to ground in those survivor-centered practices. So what, going to another question, what do you all think gets in the way of providing survivor-centered advocacy on a daily basis, whether that's because you're in court or with another system? Yeah. Oh, this is a great question. So many advocates don't have spaces in courthouses and have no control over the environment. Any suggestions on creating a trauma-informed environment? Yeah, that's a great question. I have some thoughts that I will share, but if anyone else has anything that they've done that worked, that would also be great to share. I think of an advocate's role as being able to ask if the survivor needs to take any pauses, if they need to take any breaks, and being able to, go find a corner, or, in the most ideal situation, be able to step outside for a moment or something. But it is very difficult because you're in this courthouse or this environment that's essentially quite stressful. But what else? This doesn't necessarily, this could be things that come up for you personally, or it could be systems-based things. Any other thoughts on what makes that difficult? I know for me in the legal advocacy that I've done, one thing that comes up is like with legal advocacy, you know so much information about different options that you just want to offer them, and you might, like, it's hard to counter that desire to want to like fix something for someone, right? So just as I was mentioning before, thinking through what all the options are while someone's talking, and then being like, well, have you thought about doing a protection order, before, being able to check in with them and really support emotionally with what they're going through. Time. Yeah. Right. There's an overwhelming amount of clients. You're working at with multiple people at once. Yeah, people needing attorneys and knowing that that's what they need. Yeah, these are all great answers. I mean, I wish that this was not the case. But just the whole point of what I'm talking through here is like knowing that time is so limited, trying to do the best that we can to slow down and be present with as many survivors as possible. Okay, so some of the things I thought about, in terms of what gets in the way. So the inertia of the legal system, that could be those fast approaching legal deadlines that some of you mentioned, things moving quickly, or things moving, in their own way that is not aligned with survivors at all. And then, not being able to speak back to the survivor when we're in front of the commissioner. Yeah, absolutely. A high volume of survivors, very limited resources. And then I just think that like internal desire to, we're not trying to share our opinions, but we have so much expertise or have seen a lot of different folks go through this. It's hard to slow down and not just offer up what you think might be the best option based on what you're hearing. There was another response here that I really liked. that was explaining the process to the client and watching them get disappointed because it sounds so daunting to them. I think that's a really great answer. And um, you know, seeing that impact on the survivor, um, knowing how daunting or potentially how slow that legal process is going to move. I mean, I think that's where we can come in and we can validate, like, you know, this is a really hard, long process. I mean, we're supporting people through a marathon. You know, this is not going to be a short process for most survivors. And so it can be really hard to focus back on what that person wants when it's kind of like we're responding to this other system, right? So yeah, and people, that's also a really great point. People want us to have the answers, or they hope we have the answers. And oh my gosh, I believe that, you know, most of us probably wish we did too. And, you know, the fact that we can't even have an answer about how, you know, a commissioner is going to rule that day, or how something's going to go. I mean, we're living with that uncertainty too, and so we're having to really just be in that with survivors, and that can be really frustrating to them as well. Okay, so I wanted to put this out there as a way to think through legal advocacy. If you all have been in this work for a while, I'm sure you've heard WSCADV at some point talk about Jill Davies. She's really great. This is one of her books that you might have seen around. The book is not the easiest read. I would say it's like a good reference book. You might want to pull it out and look at some different parts here and there. It's pretty dense, but it's such great information. And we have had Jill out here a couple times to do some trainings. If you ever see that happening again, I highly recommend trying your best to attend, because she's really brilliant and really wants to break down for advocates some different critical thinking and analysis skills. And she really gets it and understands domestic violence and specifically advocacy in the ways that we do that. And so one of the other things that she talks about a lot is safer planning, and that's sort of aligned with more or less harm reduction. So when I say harm reduction, meaning, you know, planning for things to be as safe as possible, but knowing that they're not going to be completely safe, or knowing that people's lives are complex and they're going to make different decisions, and they might not always make the decision that we think is safest. So that is part of her approach, which I think is so important. And so she put forth this way to do systems advocacy that I think is a really great way to think through legal advocacy, specifically. So when she talks about systems advocacy, she means more like us as advocates trying to make changes in the system. And so I think that's one way you can think about it. But I think it's also a really great way to keep yourself survivor-centered with legal advocacy. So first step is prepare, which I know we're all doing, but you know, this is about doing your homework. It's about learning your legal systems, current responses to violence, how things been going in your community, as well as what survivors need from that system. So, you know, that might involve building relationships in your community, whether that is with people at the courthouse, people in law enforcement, people at the prosecutor's office, you know, getting to know who gets listened to in your community. So, you know, is the police chief the one that everybody listens to, or is it a specific prosecutor? And like getting to know those key players so that you know who to build alliances with, who you get the most traction with to advocate. And these things might be changing. That's all the time. That's part of legal advocacy as well. And so you're preparing not only to know the system, but also to know how it treats survivors, maybe how it treats survivors with certain identities, because that's really important. Given all the discrimination and bias we know survivors are experiencing, not just as people of color, or not just as immigrants, but even just gender-based discrimination or discrimination for being survivors, and slut shaming, and victim blaming, all of that stuff. That's very important to know and to plan for as you're walking someone through these systems. So then the next step would be to think. So I'm certain everyone out there is thinking, but what I really mean by this is that the legal system is super process oriented. So it's like, you might want to explain to someone, first you do this, and then we do this, and then we do this. And so there's like some really tangible actions you can take. And what I've just noticed is that it can feel really good to take a tangible action, especially in the face of like trauma and overwhelming violence that's just unthinkable. It's like you want to do something about it, and the survivor might want to do something about it. And so just sitting with that urgency and like being able to tease out when there is some actual urgency and when it's like coming from a place of wanting to do something, and if at all possible, slowing down. And I don't even think this has to take a great amount of time. I think it just has to do with um, checking in, and like I had mentioned before, not offering up solutions too quickly, and being able to check in with people. So for instance, I had talked about being able to say to someone, I have information about protection orders. That's something that we can talk about if you're interested in it. I've worked with people who really weren't ready to talk about protection orders, even though that's something that they ultimately chose. And so I really like to leave that in the hands of the survivor, before sort of unloading about what a process looks like, making sure that that's something that they have the space for right then, or if they really just want to like vent and get some emotional support, and then check in about options at the end of our session or the next time we talk. Being able to model that time to slow down and to hold space for emotions. Another thing with thinking, and this is adapted from Jill Davies as well, is to think through the options that we're offering folks, and are they safer and how? Are they less safe and how? And is there a disparate impact for people with different identities? So this is just one example, calling the police, and whether or not that would make someone safer. So for some people, it might stop the violence. It might remove the partner from the home or the location. That response could result in a no contact order that could keep the partner away. Or it might reduce the violent behavior. It very well may. So, for others, calling the police could increase the violence from the partner, if it could mean that the victim was arrested. The arrest could just mean that the family loses their housing or their income. And then in terms of disparate impacts that we want to keep in mind, we know that there's risks for immigrants calling the police in terms of deportation. For LGBTQ survivors, the rates of dual arrest are extremely high. And just some of the other discrimination and police violence that could be involved. And so these are just things that we want to keep in mind as we're thinking through options with people, with survivors. And being able to have the time to think through something like this, I think that once you start building in those moments for slowing down, you can really work that into part of your groove, and be able to have that space, and just get used to thinking through things like this for all survivors. Great question. So we got a question, is the idea that we are going to do that with survivors or in our own minds? So I really think that it can be a dynamic process with survivors. It can also be something that you're doing in your head. So you might, and I'm not suggesting that you sit down and fill out a chart like this with survivors, but I think that in a lot of ways, this is just another way to think of safety planning, um, or thinking through a situation. So, you might want to ask them, like, does calling the police sound like an option? How do you think your survivor might, or how do you think your partner might react if you called the police? If they're like, I'm scared to call the police, being able to and they're, let's say, an immigrant, being able to say, that's very fair. We know that there is immigration authority activity in our community, and we know that the police, sometimes it does lead to deportation, so that is a huge risk. Being able to just incorporate this into your conversation, um, yeah, it, both directly and presenting it, like, to validate um, some things that survivors are sharing with you. Okay, and then planning. I mean, this is definitely where a lot of the slowing down comes in the planning, remembering to remember, what does the survivor want? If they really do want to, let's say, go to file for a protection order, but it is going to be very difficult for them, what can we do that will make it the most positive experience or safest experience for their well-being as possible. So, is that being able to have a couple minutes before you go in to ground together? Is that being able to come to support group that week after they go to do that because they want to be around other survivors? Um, Understanding what's possible for that person and what might go wrong along the way. I think sometimes we don't want to share what could go wrong, but I think that there are ways that as advocates that we can say, so, what I have seen is that this is what the process is, and sometimes judges rule in this way, and sometimes they rule in this way, and that can be really hard to not know. But I just want you to be aware of everything that might happen. And then, as we've been talking about, having those discussions about emotional safety planning and coping beforehand. I've seen so many times where a lot, the legal process can be so busy and overwhelming, and like you have such limited time. So you're like getting there for the hearing. Then you're there with the survivor for the hearing. You're like, are you okay? That was really hard. Okay, bye. And just trying the best that we can to be able to, like, talk with people about, like, what are you going to do after court? Like, is there someone that you can spend some time with? Or can you go take a walk? Or you have to go right back to work? Okay, like, let's check in at the end of the day. Doing whatever you can to talk people through having some sort of plan, because that is where the self-determination comes in, right? It's like, oh, yes, I'm doing this really hard thing, but I'm going to do this small thing for myself at a later moment. And then ACT, which you're all out there doing. We know with all advocacy and legal advocacy as well that, you aren't probably just going to have a plan A that goes off without a hitch. You're going to have plan B and C as well. But knowing that nothing is set in stone. Can check in with the survivor after each step. Maybe you did a lot of talking and planning about how they were going to go make this report, and then they did that. And, maybe it even went well, but just after that, the survivor was like, I don't want anything to do with that process anymore. Okay, then, creating that time to pause and break and, like, let survivors change their mind. Maybe the impact is too much. Maybe they're like, I thought I wanted to pursue this legal option and like now it's just not the time. Just knowing that things are going to change and being able to show up along the way. Yeah, what do we have? Someone suggesting a decompression session, um, going out for lunch and having a decompression session. Yeah. Um, what went on, how they feel about it, next steps. That's great. That is ideal. Being able to make that time to do that with survivors. I'm sure that's making a huge difference to slow things down. And then monitoring, this is just as much for looking at what's happening for an individual survivor as thinking about what else you might want to do in your community. So some of that change might be going and meeting with, the prosecutor to do some DV education. It might be telling WSCADV about what you see going on and being like, should it be happening like this? And if so, what can we do to change things? We're a great resource for a lot of that systems advocacy. So if you want to float some of those concerns up to us, that would be great. Sometimes it can work with, we might be in touch with higher ups from a certain state agency, or it might feed into some of the legislative work we're doing if like we're seeing X, Y, or Z happen to survivors consistently, and you're not able to fix that from like a one-on-one advocacy perspective, maybe we can create that into a larger campaign. And I think a lot of times that can help, if you feel like you're working to like change a system at the same time as you're working in it with a survivor, I think that can also give a lot of life into the work that we're doing, and not make it feel so bleak. Another way to participate would be something like Advocacy Day, and making sure that we're checking in with survivors and like making sure that we're saying things like, that sounds like a lot, you're holding a lot, how are you doing, and you matter too. And reminding people that how much they matter and how much their well-being matters, and that can be a factor in the decisions that they make in their lives. So some tools and strategies, going along the lines of like the decompression session that someone mentioned. I'm thinking a lot about tools and strategies amongst advocates as well. So time to debrief. We don't only need support in a crisis. Or for instance, if you're the only legal advocate, I hope that you have some other folks that you're able to debrief or talk things through with at your agency. In all the different places I've worked, some places this has been more prioritized than others, but I think, for me, connecting with other advocates and having that time built in consistently and reliably and prioritizing it has been hugely important, because the more that you're grounded and moving through all of that trauma that you're supporting survivors with, the more you're going to be able to model that presence and model that slowing down, and making these like really well-grounded survivor-centered choices. Again, break your isolation, especially if you're often out on your own doing these things. It can be really important to connect with other legal advocates and other advocates that are doing this work. And even if that's not an option at your agency, I'm really looking forward to, wanting to connect legal advocates with each other and do that a lot at our gatherings. And then having time to reflect on your practice. Just like I said, one of the huge impacts for me of reading this article was like just reflecting on my own practice and like some of the things I did earlier in my career that I might not want to do again, or just things that I realize when I look back on it with new eyes. And so having that reflection on your own work, I mean, we're all always learning, um, finding new ways to incorporate what's important to us and survivors. And so I think just having that space is going to improve your practice. Okay, so as we're wrapping up here, I'm going to share a few resources after this that I think are really great. But first, I wanted to ask, what's one thing that you're going to go back and do or talk about with your team? If you could write in the chat. It can just be something that you're thinking about. It doesn't have to be, directly related, but um, yeah. So it could be about debriefing. It could be something maybe, in the past, I've done a lot of grounding activities like in places like support group, but I was a little bit too nervous to bring a version of it to the courthouse. So maybe it's like learning and practicing a new shorter version of a grounding technique. Yeah, how to best advocate for clients who don't want to pursue legal action or getting involved with the police. That's something I'm thinking about a lot. And one of the resources I'm going to share is about that. So we'll definitely continue that conversation. Yeah, because, so often, so folks are sharing about grounding techniques and coping tools and focus more on emotional safety planning. And and I think that's great because that's like within our purview, right? That's within what we can do. And just I have learned in my time that creating those little moments has been hugely impactful. I worked with a survivor once who was like, I didn't think I was able to do anything. And then like I realized that we like created all this space where I could make small choices and how much difference that made in my life. Um, Outreach centered advocacy, yeah, uh-huh. Especially how DV survivors are treated in family law. I mean, that's huge and weighing on my mind a lot as well. Just the family law system is so overwhelming, and it feels like there's so much DV education that needs to be done for different players. So, if you're supporting survivors who are really going through it in the family law system, to the extent possible that you can communicate to them that they're not alone, even though, that's not the most comforting thing because it is really, really hard out there. But they aren't alone, and we're trying to we're trying to educate the players and change the way that those things are going down. Okay, so some resources here. I have gotten a hold of this book that is called Fumbling Towards Repair. If you were at the conference, you might have heard Shira Hassan speak. I am definitely, um, I'm a fangirl in general. Just like I said, I'm Chanel's fangirl, so I'm also Shira's fangirl. But this transformative justice resource is really great. It's set up as a workbook, but it includes so much space for reflection, and something that it offers is just imagining the world that we want to live in with that doesn't have violence and what that would look like. What supports will people need? How are we going to get there? I think this is a great meditation on all that, and then is trying to help people do what they call community accountability, if that's something that you're not familiar with. I think even if you're not super versed in all that, this is a great resource. Also, if you're not familiar, Legal Voice has a ton of great tools at this link on their site related to preparing for different protection order hearings, different court proceedings. I shared a lot of these resources with people before they even filed for a protection order, for people who wanted to know things in advance or know what things might be like. I also wanted to share womenslaw.org, which has been shared before, but what I thought was really cool, let me see if I can do this here, to share the site. Okay. Okay, so I just wanted to share this site here. What I found to be really helpful is this state by state section that they have, just because, you know, we are often working with survivors who are coming from somewhere else or had some other orders somewhere else. This gives a really great overview by state of those different laws, and some of the important legal information that you can click through on here. And then it also has a really great section on preparing for court by yourself, which, you know, is the reality for many survivors. And, you know, it's just very easy to use and walks you through a lot of things in a very accessible way. So I highly recommend checking out that site. I'll hop back over here. Okay. Another resource I wanted to share, if you're not familiar, is WISN, or the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network. They have a statewide hotline that they have got up and running. NIRP is also, or the Northwest Immigrants' Right Project, is also a great resource, but since more folks know about that, I just wanted to share this one out. There is at least bilingual access in English and Spanish at all times. There might be additional languages at different times, but if there is, you know, ICE or border activity in your community that you want to report, or if someone wants to report the detention of a group or individual, or if people want information to help someone who's facing deportation, just as these things are happening more frequently, I wanted to share this out so that you all have that. And again, this is going to be shared in the final version. Whoop. Okay. And so this is the last thing that I wanted to share. If you are looking for someone else to follow on social media, if I haven't given you enough folks already, Yumi Sakugawa has been putting out these really simple, so she's an illustrator as well, love her drawings, but this is what I wanted to leave you all with about rest and how important that can be for you all, and self-care. You know, this might be a challenge that you have, it might not be, but I think it's a great place to start in terms of slowing down. Especially number 3, just when you think you've rested enough, rest 3 more times just to make extra double sure that you are really well rested. I know this is something I and a lot of people that I'm close with have trouble with. And so, you know, seeing something simple like this, this is an Instagram post. If you're on Instagram, I would highly recommend checking her out. And, you know, it's just very grounding, very practical, well-being sort of advice like that. Anyways, that brings us to the end of our time. Thank you so much, everyone. If you could fill out the evaluation form that pops up at the end. And if you have any questions, please contact me. If you want to be on the DVLA listserv, send me an email. If you didn't get the email about the gathering in January and you want one, send me an email. Um, or if you want to connect and talk more about what's going on in your community and what challenges you're really facing, I am going to be making calls to you all in your programs, but I would absolutely love to hear from you. Like I said, I'm new in this position, very excited, very recently doing advocacy myself, and I would love to hear from you.